In this presentation, we are going to continue on with hypothesis testing, and we're going to look at an example here. Metro EMS, Emergency Medical Services. The Director of Medical Services wants to formulate a hypothesis test that can be used that can use a sample of emergency response times to determine whether or not the service goal of 12 minutes or less is being achieved. Just something to remark upon there is 12 minutes or less. Okay. Now, so what is of interest here, where mu is the response times, actually it's the average of response time, the population. So what we're interested in is mu is less than or equal to 12. Okay. Now, that actually would sort of like correspond to a null hypothesis. Okay. So that's going to be our null hypothesis. H0 mu is less than or equal to 12. So the H0 mu is less than or equal to 12. The emergency service is meeting the response goal. No follow-up action is necessary. There doesn't have to be any improvements to the service. The direct opposite to the null hypothesis here is the alternative hypothesis. And again, the alternative hypothesis is a direct contradiction of the null hypothesis. So mu is greater than 12. Okay, and it's the emergency service is not meeting its goal. Appropriate follow-up action is necessary. Okay, so and there we have at the bottom, mu is response times, the mean response time. Now, because hypothesis tests are based on sample data, we must allow for the possibility of these errors. These errors are quite important. So, a type 1 error is rejected the null hypothesis when in fact the null hypothesis is in fact true. It is correct. So that is one type of error. Now, the probability of making a type 1 error when the null hypothesis is true as an equality is called the level of significance. Okay, that comes into play. Now, actually, the symbol used for the level of significance is called alpha, and that is quite an important part in hypothesis testing. The thing about type 1 error is that you actually get to set your level of alpha. This is what you are prepared to accept in terms of incorrect outcomes of hypothesis tests. Now, applications of hypothesis testing that only control the type 1 error rate are often called significance tests. Now, so we're going to continue on with this metro example here. And in this case, what we're going to look at is we're going to continue on with hypothesis testing. A major West Coast city provides one of the most comprehensive emergency medical services in the world, operating on multiple hospital systems with approximately 20 mobile units. The service goal is to respond to medical emergencies with a mean time of 12 minutes or less. Now, a type 2 error is accepting the null hypothesis when it is false. So this is the follow-up to the type 1 error. This is a type 2 error. So it's difficult to control for the probability of making a type 2 error. Okay, and statisticians avoid the risk of making a type 2 error by using this statement: do not reject the null hypothesis, or fail to reject. And you never say accept the null hypothesis. You say you fail to reject the null hypothesis. There is not enough evidence to contradict the null hypothesis. You're not saying the null hypothesis is true. It's just saying there's not enough evidence to contradict it. So that gives rise to the other outcome, the two possible outcomes in a hypothesis test. You would reject or you fail to reject, or do not reject the null hypothesis. Here's the sort of table for those two types of outcome there. So so this is the four possible outcomes. I'm going to write them down here. Outcome 1, outcome 2, outcome 3, and outcome 4. Now, if you accept the null hypothesis when the null hypothesis is true, you've made a correct decision. If you've rejected the null hypothesis when the null hypothesis is false, you've also made a correct decision. Now, if you accepted the null hypothesis, sorry, let's look at this one here. If you've rejected the null hypothesis when the fact it is true, you made a type 1 error. And if you have accepted the null hypothesis when it is false, you've made a type 2 error. This table here is very useful for sort of looking at the four possible outcomes of a hypothesis test. Now, by the way, I said accept here, but really what I mean is fail to reject. It just I put in accept there because it just takes up all the slide. It's just too big on the slide, so I put in accept there. So it's actually what I really mean is fail to reject the null hypothesis. So we move on from that. There we go. Now, this is an important part here. Do you know what? I'll start this on the next presentation. We'll end it there.